there's a story about a man and a woman who buy their first home. And as they sit in the kitchen one morning to look out the window, and the wife notices that their neighbor is hanging the laundry outside. She turns to her husband and says, "My goodness, she doesn't know how to clean laundry. Look how dirty it is. I bet she doesn't use the right type of soap, or maybe doesn't know how to use the settings on her washing machine. I bet she doesn't pre-soak her laundry the way I do, or use bleach properly. I think the next time I'm outside hanging up our laundry, I'll simply shout over the fence some of these things. That'll teach her how to do laundry properly." The husband just sits there in silence and really doesn't say anything. But each time they see their neighbor outside hanging the laundry, the woman makes these same comments. Well, imagine her glee when about a month later, she looks out her kitchen window and sees clean, sparkling laundry. She runs to her husband and with glee says, "Come, you have to see our neighbor finally has learned to do her laundry. I bet all of those things I was shouting over the fence really helped her to do the right thing." Her husband simply smiles at her and shakes his head and says, "No, dear. This morning I got up early and cleaned our windows." Life is kind of like that sometimes, isn't it? What we see when we look out our windows and watch others go about their lives really depends on the clarity of the windows through which we are looking. And the clarity of our window really depends on our worldview. It depends on the beliefs that we hold on to, those life experiences that we've had, and even the reality in which we are currently living. All those things can either clear or cloudy our window. And the unfortunate thing is that, all too often, we're less worried about the clarity of our own window and more preoccupied on the cloudiness of others' windows. And if we're not careful, we find ourselves judging others too quickly, becoming critical and feeling the need to maybe correct or shout over the fence, especially if others' perspectives of life do not have the same color as ours. We kind of get caught up being like that woman who, with dirty windows, was quick to judge without realizing that her perspective might be the one that needed to be changed. I read a quote on Facebook this past week that said, "Judging a person does not define who they are. It defines who you are." So the question I want us to think about this morning is, how do you respond when you disagree with someone? And if you have your Bibles, I want to invite you to turn to Luke 10. We'll begin in verse 38. Luke 10, verse 38. It says, "As Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to them. She had a sister called Mary, who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. But Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. She came to him and asked, 'Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me.' 'Martha, Martha,' the Lord answered, 'you are worried and upset about many things. But few things are needed, or indeed only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her.'" Now we enter this story in the middle of a road trip. Jesus and his disciples were on their way, but where are they going? Well, at this point in Jesus' ministry, they are heading towards Jerusalem. However, before they get there, Jesus decides to make a pit stop, and they enter a certain village called Bethany. Now we know that's the name of the town because of who he encounters there: Mary and Martha. In verse 38, we read that Martha has opened her home to them. Now that phrase, her home, might seem very insignificant to us, but it actually tells us a lot about who Martha is. Her home means that Martha is the oldest of the siblings. Her home signals that she is the one in charge of making sure that everything within the home runs smoothly. Martha's responsible for every guest who enters her home. It's her job to take care of them, make sure that they're welcomed and they feel comfortable. You see, in a Jewish household, to invite someone into your home where it would be expected that you provide a meal for them around the table was the same as inviting them into God's house to the table of worship. So it would be no surprise that in verse 40, we read that Martha is distracted by all the preparations that need to be made. She's under a lot of pressure. She wants to honor Jesus while making sure that the disciples feel welcomed and comfortable, and this creates a lot of extra chores. Martha's trying to live up to the expectation that maybe some of us women do even today. This idea that your home is a reflection of who you are. Messy house, messy spouse. So I want you to picture this scenario in your head for a moment. Martha is running around. She's trying to make sure that everything is perfect, that Jesus feels comfortable, that his disciples feel welcomed. And as she runs through the room where Jesus sits teaching his disciples someone catches his eye. She turns around and there she sees her sister sitting. In verse 39, we read, she had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. Now, can you imagine the frustration and the anger that Martha must have felt in that moment? I mean, how dare Mary sit while Martha serves? It's an insult to Mary as the oldest. Martha listens while Mary gives directions for all the preparations. You see, Mary and Martha are actually focused on the same thing, Jesus. But each evaluates and handles the situation differently. They're looking at the scenario through different colored windows. And it's through these windows that they must decide how to handle the situation. Now, the beautiful thing that I think as we read this story is that Jesus' response is that both of their actions are valid. Jesus doesn't scold Martha for running around or preparing the meal that they're about to eat, or that she's making sure that all of his disciples feel welcome and taken care of. He knows that in her heart, this is the way she shows love. However, at the same time, he doesn't reprimand Mary for her actions either. He allows her to continue to sit at his feet and listen as he teaches. No, the problem here is how Martha responds to those she disagrees with. In the face of this very tense disagreement, Martha gives into her distractions. But Jesus demonstrates patience. Have you ever allowed the events of a disagreement to distract you from the root of the disagreement? In other words, you get so caught up in what someone is saying or doing that you actually forget why you were disagreeing with them. I have this friend that whenever we get together and get into a conversation, especially if it's around a hot topic, I find that while I'm speaking to him, it seems like he's not even listening to me, but instead is thinking about what he's going to say next. And if I'm not careful, I fall right into that trap. I become worried about proving that I am right, and I don't take the time to actually listen to what he's saying. And in the end, both of us end up speaking over each other, and neither of us really learns anything new. Being right becomes our focus. Just like Martha, we give into our distractions instead of responding to each other in patience. Our emotions take over, and, well, I hate to admit this, we often end up feeling angry at one another. In verse 40, we read that Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. She came to him and asked, "Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me." Martha gives into the distraction of the disagreement, and then anger explodes. And it's interesting, she's not just angry at one person, she's actually angry at two people. First, we see, of course, her anger towards Mary. "My sister has left me to do all the work. Tell her to help me." Jealousy begins to swell in this woman's heart, and she demands Mary get up and help her. Now, the truth is, it would have been Mary's duty as the younger sister to help. She's the younger of the two, and while Martha would be supervising all the work that needed to be done, it was Mary's responsibility to get her hands dirty and actually do the work. But instead, she chooses to sit quietly at Jesus' feet. And this decision infuriates Martha. And so she decides the best way to handle the disagreement is to call Mary out in front of Jesus and all the disciples. It's kind of like she's tattling on her or shaming her. She wants to make sure that Mary doesn't get away with slacking off. But Martha's anger doesn't stop there. Not only is she mad at Mary, she's also mad at Jesus. "Lord," she says, "don't you care?" I can almost hear Mary's thoughts in that question. I'm sure she's wondering why Jesus doesn't tell Mary to help her. Why does he just keep on teaching while she's running around making all the preparations? Doesn't he realize that she too would like to sit at his feet but just can't at that moment? I'm sure she's wondering why he can't just wait until she's done. All of Martha's emotions are drawing her away from the very person that she's trying to please. Martha gives in to her anger, but Jesus shows her love. Verse 41, I can almost see Jesus shaking his head and in a very soft and quiet voice says, "Martha, Martha," the Lord answered, "you are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed, or indeed, only one." You see, it's in that moment that Jesus puts his finger on Martha's spiritual problem. She's so worried about other things that she forgets the most important thing, turning to Jesus and spending intimate time with him. You see, this is Mary's response. Instead of letting distractions of the situation take over, she responds by focusing on Jesus and sitting at his feet. And I'm sure Jesus appreciated all the work that Martha was doing for his arrival, but that's not what he treasured most. Martha allowed her work for Jesus to distract her from her time with Jesus. And if I'm honest with myself, I've had that happen to me as well. I allow my distractions to take away my time for Jesus. I allow my time with Jesus to be taken over for the work that I want to do for Jesus. You see, in moments like those, we need to remember that Christ wants our hearts before our hands. Christ wants our time before our tasks. Jesus reminds us that even though it is important to serve him, it is more important to worship him. Martha, Martha, the Lord answered, you are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed, or indeed only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken from her. Martha gives into her anger, but Jesus shows her love by pointing her back to himself. Now, we don't exactly know how this story ends. We don't know if Martha stomps off in disgust or if she drops to her knees and sits right then and there at Jesus' feet. We don't know if they get fed that night or if they go to bed hungry, but if I had to guess, I would bet that at some point Martha feels conviction and Jesus extends forgiveness. You know, this would be at the heart of Jesus' ministry. This is who God has always been. In Psalm 145 that you read earlier here in the service, we were reminded as the psalmist proclaims, the Lord is trustworthy in all his promises and faithful in all he does. The Lord upholds all who fall and lifts up all who are bowed down. The Lord is near to all who call on him, to all who call on him in truth. You see, Jesus faces Martha's disagreement where she allows distractions and anger to take control and in turn responds by showing patience, showing love, and extending forgiveness. You know, I began this sermon by asking you the question, how do you respond when you disagree with someone? And lately, this is something I have really been struggling with. You know, I have this bad habit of constantly checking Facebook. I love to keep up with what my friends and family are doing. I love to see how families and friends are growing. I love to see the experiences that they are having. And I'll be honest, I truly love it when someone is willing to put themselves out there and get real and talk about how their day just is not going the way it should be. But you know, lately I've really felt like Facebook has become tiresome. At times it feels like it's draining the life out of me and it is sucking out my soul. I get weary. Because it feels like we have gone from sharing and inspiring one another to shouting at one another. It feels like we've gone from encouraging one another to discouraging one another, from listening to one another to shouting over one another and demanding to be heard. And you know, I believe there are times when we need to stand up and bring attention to dire situations. We need to speak out to injustices, and Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and any other social media has given this platform to us which allows us to reach out and bring attention to these things to so many more people than we've ever been able to do before. And that's great. It's amazing. The unfortunate part, though, is it's also become a place where too many of us feel like we can say whatever we want, about whomever we want, however we want. People have begun to hide behind their computers and say harmful things without any accountability at all. They insist that they are right and everyone else is wrong. You know, it kind of feels like if we're not exactly for what they believe, then we must be their enemy. You know, when you don't have to face someone and see how your words hurt them, it's easy then to shout over them and at them and allow your words to penetrate and go straight through them. And the unfortunate thing is, I know that this is not going away anytime soon. We are facing too many crises as a people. We have this global pandemic that isn't going away anytime soon, and it affects every aspect of our lives. We have people shouting to vaccinate or not to vaccinate, to begin in-person learning in school, to not begin in-person learning at school, to wear a mask, to not wear a mask, and the list goes on. We're coming up on an election year where, honestly, I feel like we are more divided than we've ever been. And we're constantly facing systemic racism, ageism, sexism, and that list goes on. Opinions and facts, truths and lies will continue to circulate. We're going to be faced with this question for a really long time. How will we respond when we disagree with someone? And if I'm honest, the temptation to block people on social media is strong. But then I look to Jesus, and I see that even when others disagreed with him or shouted at him or mocked him or verbally abused him, Jesus responded in love, in patience, and in forgiveness. He showed us that in this encounter between Mary and Martha and throughout his life, that just because you disagree with someone doesn't mean that you still can't love them and have a relationship with them. You know, I've never quite understood this notion that when you disagree with someone, it means that you can no longer love or like them. It means you can no longer come around the table and be a part of them. But if we're honest, we don't agree with 100% of anyone. Not our spouse, not our family, not our friends, not those we go to church with. So again, I ask you, how will you respond to someone you disagree with? Will you insist that you are right without taking time to consider your window into life might be cloudier than you think? Are you willing to patiently listen, to show love in your response, and to extend forgiveness when necessary? Brothers and sisters, may our lives mirror Jesus both today and in the days to come. Amen.